Our first speaker today is Dr. Katherine Morris. Dr. Morris is a physician who has practiced in Oregon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and currently in Oklahoma City. During her time in Oregon, Dr. Morris helped provide end-of-life treatment for patients. Dr. Morris was also one of the named plaintiffs in the New Mexico case, Morris v. Brandenburg. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Morris.
Wow, what a crowd. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for this kind invitation. I was incredibly excited to hear about this conference, and to be invited to be a part of it with this many esteemed people is truly remarkable. After the excitement died down, however, I realized I was going to be one of the few doctors in a room full of attorneys talking about a legal issue. So I decided to be like this cat. All joking aside, I really appreciate the chance to share some personal insights. I'm really speaking as a personal citizen, not as a representative of any institution. But I'd like to share these insights that I've accumulated over years of working with dying patients and their families face to face during some of the most profound moments in their life and also in mine. I hope that this personal and medical perspective adds something, a small contribution to your legal work. Before I get started, though, I would like to take us out of our coffee mode, take us out of our frontal lobes, and ask you guys to consider, if people in this room have been in a room with someone when they died, if you would be comfortable raising your hand. Okay, so that's a rich experience that not a lot of Americans have had. And I'd like you to remember back to that experience and remember the sights and the sounds and the smells. And I'd like you to ask yourself if that death that you witnessed honored the life of that individual. Okay, thank you. So just a little bit of background, data that I'm pretty sure this crowd all knows, so I'll go quickly through it. And then I'll talk about my transition from being a supporter of this concept and this practice to being truly invested in it and why that happened. And then I'd like to give my non-legal expert opinion on why I think this is exactly the type of matter that should be decided in the courts. So a little bit of background. Some of the arguments and discussions that I've heard going through this process are that physician aid in dying is or is not a suicide. I very strongly believe it is not a suicide, and having been with patients when they took this option at the end of their life, I can tell you it's the exact opposite. It is the most life-affirming thing I've ever witnessed. I think suicide in the past has been described as a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and I will tell you that the patients who seek this option do not have a temporary problem. They're facing their last problem, and it's permanent. So I feel pretty passionate about that distinction. In addition, people will often tell you that physicians make mistakes, and I'll stand here in front of 300 attorneys and say, yeah, we do, all the time. So there is some data, however, about how accurate we are in predicting end of life. And when one study looked at our ability to predict end of life timing within a very tight time frame, and we got it right 58% of the time, which is not great odds. But then when you look in the literature and you realize that the bulk of data on this subject shows that we overestimate life more than underestimate it, I think it gives you a little bit of pause to that argument. And then there's the concern about coercion. And I can tell you as a physician, nothing would hurt me more deeply than the thought of someone being encouraged to use this law or coerced into using this option. Having said that, we have 20 years of data from Oregon, and we have no evidence of that occurring. So at this point, in my mind, this is a theoretic risk. I'd also like you to consider the other side of coercion, what it would be like to be coerced into not having an option that is available in other states that you want, and being forced into a death that is not the type of death that you want to go through. So the who and the why, I think we're all familiar with this data. This is from the Oregon data, which I think is the richest body at this point. These are overwhelmingly patients in the end stages of cancer, followed by ALS. This is usually an educated population. 99.2% in the last year in Oregon were insured. This is not a lack of access to care option that people consider. Nearly 90% were enrolled in hospice, and the number one reason for using this law was fear of loss of autonomy. It's not because of incredible pain, although many of these patients are in incredible pain. It's not because they fear being a burden to their families, although I don't think anyone wants that. It's because they fear that their dying process is taking from them what made them human beings, what made them an individual. So in terms of my support for this law, I was a second-year medical student when it was on the ballot in Oregon in 1994, and I voted for it. I was raised Catholic, and I really took to heart the values that I was raised with, the values of respect for the individual, respect for a person's decision, and respect for humanity. The church that I went to taught me that there were many paths to God, and that all of us had a unique one and needed to respect those other paths of other people so that they would respect ours. So ironically, this law fit my values. Also, I have to confess that being a surgeon, or becoming a surgeon, I thought no one's gonna ask me for this. This is gonna be something medical oncology has to think about. Only moderately ashamed to say that. So I was an intern in 1997 when it came on the ballot again, and again I voted in favor, in support of the law. And I was pretty outraged as a fourth-year resident when Attorney General Ashcroft challenged it. And I was finally, 9 years later, a first-year attending physician when that case was argued in front of the Supreme Court. So all of this was very much in my frontal lobes, and I was in support until I met this woman. I think a lot of you in the room are familiar with this woman because she was featured in the documentary How to Die in Oregon, so I'll try to cut through the meat of the story quickly. This is Cody Curtis and her family in Hong Kong about 3 years prior to her diagnosis. This is what she looked like when I met her, and she was an incredible human being. She was well educated. She had a PhD and worked in the field of biomedical informatics. So this woman knew the data on her disease better than anyone. When she came to see me with this large tumor, she said, I've lived a good life, Dr. Morris. I'm not entirely sure I want to sign up for what you're selling. And what I was selling was a major liver resection with a 1% chance of mortality and a 60% chance of complications. She went home and she talked to her family. She went and saw a couple of other surgeons, and then she came back to my office and she said, okay, let's go for it. And go for it we did. And it was an incredibly challenging recovery for her. It took months. It took a prolonged ICU stay. It took her body taking on 50 pounds of water weight, which she then had to shed. And it took a second operation to get her through this, but we got her through it. And just as she was starting to claim her life again and go back to being the incredible woman and productive member of society that she was, we did a follow-up CT scan, and a friend of mine who's a radiologist called me and said, we have recurrence. She's got lung lesions, she has liver lesions, this is metastatic disease. So I had to make that phone call, and I still remember it was Valentine's Day, February 14th, and I called and I told her, and she said, okay, Dr. M, you know what I'm gonna ask for. And I said, no, what do you need? And what I was thinking was, oh no, she's really gonna ask. No one had asked me for this before, again, because I'm usually at the beginning end of people's cancer care. Being the graceful woman that she was, she said, I know this is heavy, I know you need to think about this, but please take the time that you need and let me know, because I understand if you can't do it, I need to find someone else. So I went home and I talked to my family and I talked to my friends, and I thought a lot about it, and I decided to be her prescribing physician. And it remains one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make in my life, despite my lifelong support for this concept. She got the medication after a prolonged process, 2 weeks, 2 requests, 1 oral, 1 written, and she got the medication and put it in her bedside table. And she told me that the minute it landed there, she felt a huge sense of peace and relief, and she felt like she could enjoy the time that she had left. And she had a great 7 months. She had incredibly excellent palliative care and hospice. She did beautifully. And then slowly, as she put it, the wheels started coming off. And she called me one December and she said, I'm suffering now. I'm going to take the medication. This is too much. It's too much to have liters of fluid drained from my abdomen every week. It's too much to be on an antibiotic that conflicts with my ability to eat cheese. And it's true story. It's just too much. I'm suffering. And she asked if I would be there. And just to paint the picture of what it's like to walk into the house of someone who's going to take a lethal dose of Seconal. Her family was there, her parents were there, her husband was there, and her children were there. Her best friend was there. She was kind of like Martha Stewart, and I joked to her about this. There was a sideboard full of popcorn balls that were green and red for Christmas that she had made in that last weekend of her life. This is a woman who was painting a picture and telling a story. And she took that medication with more determination than I've seen anyone do anything in life. I tell you this story because she died exactly the way she wanted. She wrote that last story of her life, and I think it's what all of us could hope for in one way or another. The next story I'm going to tell you, I apologize for the quality of this photo, but it's what I had. This is Teresa and her dogs Coda and Sasha. Teresa was 36 when I met her, and she chose another type of death. Teresa had been kind of an iconoclast all of her life. She would up and move to Costa Rica to open a bar. She'd move back. She became a wine distributor. And then she was found to have this grapefruit-sized mass in her groin that was an aggressive sarcoma. And she had basically fought through everything her entire life, and she decided that this cancer was public enemy number one, and she was going to fight it. And fight it she did. She went through chemotherapy. She went through a 7-hour surgery. She went through radiation. And on her first post-treatment scan, she was found to have lung metastasis. It was a pretty big kick in the gut. And just to give you a reference, for most patients with a high-grade sarcoma recurrence that quickly, they would usually be dead within a year. Teresa wasn't going to have any of that. She basically gave the middle finger to this cancer and spent 3 years crossing the country going through clinical trials. She had another surgery. She took more than the maximum dose of a chemotherapy agent, and she really fought this. And while she was in Portland awaiting evaluation for a trial in Bethesda, she started coughing up blood, and she went to the ER. I met her boyfriend and her mother there, and it was clear that she was struggling to breathe, and she asked us to put a ventilator, so we did. And then we did a CAT scan and found that one of these tumors had eroded into her pulmonary artery, and so she was going to drown in her own blood. I talked to every physician I could think of to try and come up with some way to get her to that clinical trial that was her dream, and we had nothing. So she died. And even though she died in the ICU, and it was rough, she died exactly the way she wanted. So I think it's pretty clear that these stories still affect me. This last story haunts me. And I want to tell you the story of Mark McEwen. That's his legs and his beloved dog Maddie on the Bosque, where they biked. And that's him. And these pictures were taken a few months before he eventually died. They were also taken before he knew he had a tumor the size of your head in his abdomen, in his liver. So Mark, by the time he met me, had already seen medical oncology seeking treatment, and they said, "You're too sick. We cannot give you chemotherapy. And it's not going to work." He'd been talked about by interventional radiologists and radiation oncologists, and they all said, "He's too sick. I can't give you this treatment." So he came to see me, and he said, "You're a surgeon," and I said, "Yeah," and he said, "You can't cut this out, can you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I would like physician aid in dying." And this was during the brief moment right after the first decision in which it was legal. And for reasons which are kind of long and complicated, I wasn't able to offer that to him. But I stayed in touch with him and his family, and we fought to get this option for him, and he could tell you very eloquently why he wanted it. This was an athlete. This was a guy who spent his entire life enjoying the wilderness and the wonderful things in New Mexico. And he knew he didn't want to take this dying process out to the end, and he knew he had no treatment options. While we were going through that process, he became too ill, and his wife called me and said, "It's gone too far now. We're not going to be able to do this. He's in terminal delirium." For people that haven't seen terminal delirium, it's where you don't know where you are. It's where you pick at things in the air that aren't there. You have visual hallucinations. Some people think you have auditory hallucinations. And what was so hard for her was, despite excellent hospice care, which she loved and we all loved, he would do things like not know where he was and fall out of bed. And because he now was so swollen due to the cancer, he weighed about 230 pounds. He normally weighed about 150. So he'd fall out of bed, and they'd have to sit there on the floor, him confused and disoriented, while they waited for a hospice nurse to come and help her get him back into bed. And she called me and she said, "How long is this going to go on? How can this be right?" And I didn't have an answer for her, and it was very painful. So to those who would say, "First, do no harm," I would like to direct you to his widow, because she will give you a good dose of what harm by the majority looks like for an individual. So, why do I think this is a matter for the courts? And now I'm stepping out of my comfort zone, but I'd like to tell you, kind of try to put into context what it was like to get that decision rendered by the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you about one of the patient phone calls that I was getting when that decision came out. A day after the decision came out, one of my favorite patients called me, and she said, this is a woman who'd been fighting cancer for many years, and we never discussed physician aid in dying. This is not about that. But to tell you what she was going through, when I met her, she had suffered her third recurrence of a type of cancer in her pelvis, and we performed what's called a pelvic exenteration to try and buy her some time. Now, keep in mind, she signed up for this surgery that I'm going to describe to you, knowing that it was not going to be curative, but it would hopefully buy her some time. So pelvic exenteration is where I take out everything in your pelvis, and for her, that was her uterus, her cervix, her bladder, her rectum, and her anus. You're left with a bag for urine and a bag for stool on your abdomen. And she did this, and she did it willingly, and she came through it like a champ. And she bought herself 7 months. And around the time this decision came out, she'd suffered a recurrence, and it was a recurrence we could no longer remove because it had grown into her sacrum, causing pretty severe pain. And the tumor had also eroded into her small bowel and eroded into her vagina. And so the problem we were trying to deal with on a palliative basis was continuous leakage of acidic stool out of her vagina 24/7. Yeah, so we tried everything we could think of and nothing was working. And she told me the day after this decision came out that the only relief she could get was sitting in a tub, and she would sit in the tub in lukewarm water until she remembered she was sitting in her own stool and she could not bear it any longer, and she'd get out. So it was particularly difficult for me to read that this was a matter for the legislature, a matter for the general public to vote on how long this woman was going to endure this and what options she had, when if she lived in Oregon, she would have had another option. So to me, that decision said that us, all of us, the general public, have a right to vote and tell this woman when it's okay for her to say, enough, I'm dying. I'm thankful for my life and my family and my loved ones, but I want to be able to say when it's enough, and I want to take control of how that happens. So I was angry, and I'm here to understand a little bit more about that. But because my career is not in law, and because the title of this talk was Establishing New Rights, and because this seems not a new right, but a human right to me, I tried to do a little research and reading. And I learned about rights and the distinction between civil rights and civil liberties. And I started reading about human rights, which led me to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm going to read this quote. It's from one of the signatories. And after I read this document, I couldn't believe it was written in 1948. And I couldn't believe we've made so little progress working towards the ideals written in this really beautiful document. But this gentleman from Chile said, I perceived clearly that I was participating in a truly significant historic event in which a consensus had been reached as to the supreme value of a human person, a value that did not originate in the decision of a worldly power, but rather in the fact of existing, which gave rise to the inalienable right to live free from want and oppression and to fully develop one's personality. So to me, writing the last page of my life story is part of fully developing my own personality. And to me, physician aid in dying is one potential way to write that page. So to finish off, I wanted to end with some wonderful, eloquent quote about dying, and that would try to encapsulate all the emotions that I felt in going through this in the last 20 years. And I Googled death poems, because I thought that would get me something useful. And that got me 32,500,000 hits. And I then spent several hours reading through them, crying and laughing and yelling down the hall at my husband. And it made me realize that we really don't have a clue about this. And it made me remember how we tried to handle this in my medical school training. So, I kid you not, at 24, I was getting ready to go into the clinical rotations, and to prepare us for this, they had a 2-hour session on death and dying to try and help us understand this. And because it's medical school, and in medical school you have to have objectives for every lecture, this is the objective they gave us. Seriously. Even at 24, when I hadn't lost anything other than a beloved pet, this didn't make any sense to me. Having said that, I bring it up because it kind of makes me smile at the idealism and hope of my profession. And it humbles me to know how far any single one of us are from this lofty goal. There's 32 million poets, there's innumerable spiritual texts, there's careers in philosophy, ethics, and law that have been made on this topic, and we still don't get it. And I don't think any of us will until we're there. So that is exactly why I think it's a matter for the courts. It is far too complex, too rich, and too individual a process to be decided by a popular vote. While every single one of us are heading towards that final end, each and every one of us will do it individually, and I hope for all of us in a way that honors our lives and our loved ones. The legislative process, in my mind, does not lend itself towards predicting or protecting minority populations, and in the dying process, all of us are a minority of one in the way that we're going to do this. So I firmly believe that we all deserve the dignity and the human right of writing that last page and stories for ourselves. Physician aid in dying is one way of writing that last page. Terminal sedation is another. Finding grace in suffering or raging into that dark night are others. Excuse me. So dying may be one of the toughest things any of us do. And I'm losing my voice. I personally want as many options as possible on the table when I'm doing it. So I'll leave you with these 3 people, and I want you to remember their faces and their beautiful lives as you have this intellectual discussion today. Thank you.